This is Stanford Engineering's The Future of Everything, and I'm your host, Russ Altman. You know, if you're enjoying the show, or if you like to listen to it, we really would love it if you would rate and review it. I'm told that this is the most important thing, other than my interviews, that I can say on this podcast. Rating and reviewing, we like to get a 5.0 if we deserve it. Reviews tell people why you like it or why you don't like it. It's really useful, and it helps grow the show. It also helps us get feedback from you. So thanks very much for doing it. Rate and review. Today, Yair Bannett from Stanford University will tell us that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder can be diagnosed in young children, and it's super important to do so you can implement treatments to help them avoid the lifetime risks that come with that disease. It's the future of ADHD. Today, we are continuing our new feature, The Future in a Minute. At the end of my interview with Yair, I'll ask him a few rapid questions. He'll give a few rapid answers, and that'll be it. Before we get started, another reminder, we love it when you rate and review. It helps us, it helps the show, it feeds the algorithm. Thanks for doing it. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a disease that we've seen diagnosed much more in the last couple of decades. Developmental behavioral pediatricians are the specialists who study this disease and who understand how to diagnose it, how to treat it, and why it's so important to treat. It's difficult to diagnose, especially in small children, but it is possible, and recognizing the disease early allows physicians to start treatments, both medical treatments, drugs, as well as non-pharmacological treatments that can really improve the life and the future of the patient who suffers from ADHD. Well, Yair Bannett is a developmental behavioral pediatrician at Stanford University and an expert at ADHD. He saw it as a primary physician pediatrician in the clinics, and then he made it his research passion. He'll tell us about ADHD, its symptoms, its treatments, and what the future is like. Yair, why did you decide to study ADHD, especially in children who are pretty young?
Well, thank you for having me, Russ. It's great to be on the podcast. And I'd like to say that initially I started being interested in ADHD as a primary care pediatrician. When I first trained as a resident, I didn't have a lot of exposure to developmental and behavioral problems. But then as a pediatrician, as a PCP in the community, I noticed that parents often came to me with these concerns for ADHD and other developmental concerns. And so I started learning more and more about developmental behavioral pediatrics, and I decided I want to specialize and know how to support children who have these challenges.
Okay, great. So I think what we should do to start is establish some of the basic facts about the disease. So first of all, we called it ADHD, but it is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Tell me if I'm wrong. And could you give a little picture about, like, what are the symptoms, what's known about the causes? Where are we with this disease right now?
Absolutely. So ADHD is a very common condition, and the prevalence varies. Also, I'll talk about the United States, but it even varies within the United States. And somewhere between 8 to 10% of children get diagnosed with ADHD. That is pretty high prevalence. And the symptoms we're talking about, the core symptoms, are hyperactivity and impulsivity, as well as inattention. Those are the core symptoms. And as anything in the DSM, the manual that defines this condition, there has to be a functional impairment. So it's not enough to only have these symptoms, right? All of us sometimes are inattentive or have a lot of energy, but it has to be impairing. It has to prevent you as a child or as an adult from doing what you need to do. And another stipulation is that it has to occur in at least two settings. So it can't just be at home that you're presenting with these symptoms. It has to be at least in two settings. And again, for children, typically the two settings would be home and school.
So that's really interesting. And in my lifetime, my impression is that the frequency of diagnosis has gone way up, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But let me dive a little bit into those. You said hyperactivity is one of the, and attention deficit. It's in the title. Where do we get our baselines from, and how does a parent know if what they're seeing is at a normal level? Because these can be kids, and like kids are crazy. But and how can they figure out, and how does the clinician figure out if this level of activity is dysfunctional? What are the Can you give a little bit more about the signs that they see, maybe typical situations that a parent or a teacher might find themselves in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, and it also ties to the to your first question around why I chose to focus on young children, because I think that's where it becomes the hardest to
Right.
distinguish, right? Because they're always bouncing around. And so, yes, I think that the short answer is it's very hard to distinguish. And I think that's part of the controversy around ADHD that exists, where some people will say, oh, it doesn't even exist. There's no such thing. It's just kids being kids. And I think, as you know, as experts in the field, we all agree that's not true, and it's a spectrum, like many other things. And so, for parents, for especially first-time parents, it is
Right.
pretty much impossible to distinguish and know. And that's where they go to the pediatrician and say, "Hey, I'm not sure. Is this normal or not?" And that's exactly what happens often. That's what happened in my office as a PCP, where I said, "Okay, I want to get more training and understand how to distinguish when it is." Within the realm of normal, let's just watch and wait, or gives minimal supports versus more. And so again, it's a type of a condition that where the diagnosis relies on behavioral observations, on reporting, subjective reporting from the parents, from teachers often, and all of these vary, right? So sometimes you might have one type of parent or one type of teacher that will report things, and then another parent or another teacher will report very differently, right? So you can imagine how inaccurate it might be. And so we have to, again, as experts, we have to use our clinical judgment many times, use our own observations as well in the clinic to make a decision.
Now, what do we understand about the causes of the disease? You know, there's always nature versus nurture. There's a million other things, of course, but do we think this is fundamentally an inborn feature of the patient, of the child, or is this something that is a response to environmental conditions? And I understand completely how this is a very sensitive issue, because you don't want to tell a parent you created an environment that created this disease, right? I mean, this is a very difficult, I'm guessing, assessment.
That's right. That's right. So we do know for sure over the past few decades, the data is gathering, to clearly say there are inborn differences in children with ADHD. We know there are genetic components to it. We know that there are differences in the brain structure of individuals with ADHD. And so, yes, the answer is it is something that is inborn. At the same time, as with all of these conditions, and including autism, for example, which is another condition that we see frequently in our specialty, um, the answer is yes, the environment can also have an influence. We don't know yet to what extent, I would say, but in ADHD specifically, there's this whole question around, for example, screen time and how much that's influencing. And so again, the answers are not there yet, but I would say for certainly we always assure parents that, it's nothing that you did wrong, typically, unless it's a very extreme case. Most likely it is the way the child is born, and we can just try to adapt the household, and maybe this household needs to be a little bit different. And so the environment is not only a part of the problem potentially, it actually a lot of times is a part of the solution.
Great. So a few more questions, because this is really, really very helpful. You made a very intriguing side comment that the prevalence may be different in not only in different parts of the world, but in different parts of the United States. Talk to me about what's known about that, because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has a prevalence rates that it publishes, and the last time I looked, it looks like the West Coast specifically, and we are in California now, has lower prevalence compared to the East Coast. Those are kind of, I would say, the two extremes in terms of the prevalence, where it's the lowest around the West Coast, and it's the highest, I would say, in the northeast of the United States. And that has been true for a while.
Huh.
And I don't know to say, again, I'm not an epidemiologist. It's hard for me to say, the reasons behind it. I'm not sure anyone does know, but, um, there's this argument always about how much of it is true prevalence versus just, higher detection in certain
Yeah.
areas. There are cultural aspects to it as well. One of the things we know is that in Hispanic patients, the prevalence is lower, for example. And one of the thoughts would be that, in certain cultures, maybe there's just more tolerability for a wider, presentation of behavior and development.
So, what about on the global scene? So, I know you. I think you mentioned that you practiced in Israel for many years as a primary care physician. Did you see a similar syndrome there? And what do you know about other cultures and other continents?
Yeah, I would say that, yes, to your question about Israel, it is very similar prevalence to the United States, and many other, I would say, westernized uh, countries. We find pretty similar prevalences. I think it becomes harder in other countries where maybe the monitoring also of these conditions is not as accurate or as robust, and it's just harder to know the real prevalence. So again, it's really hard to tease out how much is just it's about the monitoring and being able to give a good number versus maybe, like we said earlier, differences in cultural perceptions.
Yes, yes. And then I also wanted to get a sense for the natural history. You're dealing with children, and we're going to talk about treatments, of course. That's I'm sure people are very interested in that. I am very interested in that. But before we get to treatments, if untreated or if it's not recognized, can you give us a sense for what is the natural history? What is the type of life and the type of challenges that a patient might have over time?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think this is again one of the areas where there are large misconceptions about ADHD. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to answer that. I would say first, one of the things we know is that ADHD is a lifelong condition. It was originally thought to be not too long ago. It was thought to just be a childhood disorder. And what happens is children at some age eventually stop bouncing around. And so you don't see adults, bouncing around typically, right? But many of these adults who had ADHD and were bouncing around still have ADHD, even though they're
Huh,
not bouncing around.
huh.
So that's one important thing to know. And the second part is that ADHD really is a serious condition and it can be quite debilitating and it can create a lot of strain on an individual who has it. And there are very significant studies over the years that are large prospective studies that showed that ADHD is associated with higher bad outcomes, including mortality. And so they are more likely to get into car accidents, they're more likely to be injured in general, they're more likely to have drug abuse, alcohol abuse problems, mental health issues, incarceration, holding a job, right, employment issues, of educational, of course, I didn't mention problems in not completing school or education. So it is a very serious condition and it's a lifelong condition. And so that I would say the natural history before, and we'll talk about treatment, like you said, but I'd say
Yeah.
the natural history can be quite grim. And again, it is a wide spectrum. So obviously there are many people who have ADHD and certainly thrive, but it can be quite debilitating.
And what is our ability? So now I'm very interested. What is our ability for adult physicians to recognize ADHD and make that diagnosis later in life? I'm imagining that it's more difficult. You're kind of attuned to it. There are parents who are worried. There may be teacher reports. You're a pediatrician, and I know you might not see 18-year-olds or 30-year-olds or 50-year-olds. So how good are we in our primary care for adults in recognizing this disorder?
Yeah, so I would say it's hard to recognize, especially now adults these days. Typically, what we hear in clinic, because they bring their children who have
Right.
ADHD, right? So as I mentioned, there's a genetic component. So I do get to see them in the office as parents, not as the adult pediatrician, but or the adult physician. But to answer your question, what we mostly see is adults saying, "Oh, I think I had ADHD, but I've never been diagnosed." And one of the criteria actually in the DSM for diagnosing ADHD is that the symptoms have to appear before age 12. So the idea again is that
Ah,
to talk about ADHD, we're talking about something that emerges in childhood, because if it's something else that emerges only in adulthood, likely it's something
I
else,
see. Oh, that's an
not
important
ADHD.
distinction then. So they'll have to be going back and thinking about what life was like before they were 12. So as an adult, they would have to talk to their parents, people who remember
That's
them, and kind of there would be a little bit of archaeology going on there to figure out if in retrospect that could have been what was happening.
That's right. And there is also better recognition of adults with ADHD today. I do know that from also just from reading the literature and speaking with people. Certainly more adults now going back and saying, yes, I wasn't recognized when I was a kid, but it is clear that I had ADHD and I still do. And I learned that I can, take medications that can help me function better at work, for example.
Great. Okay, good. So now let's get into treatments because, of course, people always think about pills, but I know that you've looked into both medications, but also non-medication treatments. So where are we with treatments? Uh,
So, yeah, there are two types of treatment for ADHD. There are the medications that most people know about, and there are also non-pharmacological interventions that are mostly for younger children. That the most of the research is done on younger children for that. And so when we speak with families, especially of young children, we talk about these two arms of treatment. And ultimately, for most children, we want them to receive both. So that is the gold standard, is to eventually, hopefully, you'll be getting both medication treatment and also behavioral interventions. So that's, I would say, an overview of kind of the types of treatment. We can go dive deeper into it.
yeah. So let's do that in the next segment. So this is Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Yair Bannett from Stanford University, and we'll be back with more next. Welcome back to the Future of Everything with Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Yair Bannett from Stanford University. In the first segment, we got a great tutorial on ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, its symptoms, a little bit about its causes, and we're about to start understanding what are the treatments, do they work, and why are they important. Don't forget, at the end of the conversation, we're going to have the future in a minute. Well, I'll ask Yair some quick questions and get his off-the-cuff answers. In this segment, I want to focus on treatment. So, Yair, you mentioned that there were both pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments. Let's start out with the pharmacology. What are the drugs that we use and how do they work? What should we know about them?
Great. So we use generally two types of medications. The most long-standing medication that's been around for almost 100 years now is in the category of stimulant medication. So the name of the family are stimulants. The common names you may have heard of are Ritalin and Concerta and Adderall. And so those medications are very safe to use in children. We know that they have a really significant benefit short term for sure. And immediately, once you start using the medicine, you see reductions in hyperactivity, impulsivity, and increases in attention.
I think there's a lot of confusion because they're called stimulants. So maybe you can address that. People thinking, why would you give some kid who is hyperactive a stimulant?
Yeah, so it is true, and the effect varies depending on the person. So a person without ADHD might become more stimulated. But what's interesting is, and again, this was a discovery that would just happen. It's not, people just tried it out and saw it had an amazing effect. And so what we see is that the stimulants actually create more focus. There isn't, I think the mechanism of action is not entirely, understood, I would say. But we do see that children who use stimulants typically have a large positive effect on the core symptoms of ADHD. I would say probably close to 80% of children have a positive effect.
That's great. That's great. And that's the first class is the stimulants.
That's right. So the stimulants, again, have a very strong positive effect on the symptoms. We also know from recent research, and this is very interesting, I think not many people know about this, but we do know that it also carries benefits, long-term benefits. And this is just emerging now because it's so hard to do these longitudinal studies. But there are really strong studies showing that people who are taking these medications long-term are less likely to have those bad outcomes I mentioned earlier, including incarceration, including drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and those kinds of bad outcomes, getting into car accidents. So I think that's a really important thing to know about it, because when people think about weighing the pros and cons of trying these medications, I think everyone agrees there are short-term benefits, but not everyone knows that there are actually long-term benefits as well.
And that implies, just to make a point of it, that some of these drugs you might be on either for life or for a very long time. Is that right?
That's right, and these medications are very easy in the sense that you can stop and start whenever you want. There actually isn't even a ramp up period like many other medications that are psychopharmacological medications. So yeah, it's true. A lot of and once the child grows older, he or she become the person to decide also, right? For
Right.
example, in college or later in life, do they want to take it, and when do they want to take it? And they can choose to take it on certain days or just before specific events like tests and things like that.
Oh, that's great. Oh, okay. And I think you said there were another class.
That's right. The second class of medications are called non-stimulants. The most common ones for that are alpha agonists, as well as atomoxetine. And the non-stimulant medications work a little bit differently on the brain, but they have also a smaller effect compared to the stimulants. And so they reduce the hyperactivity and the impulsivity, but they don't as much increase the attention.
Okay. And do you tend to use these together, or is it one or the other?
So in some children, we use them together. For most, it's one or the other. I would say that we're looking into using non-stimulants for younger children more often because they have less of a different side effect profile. So one of the issues with stimulants is that a lot of times the main side effect is reduction of appetite, but it can also have other problems like maybe sleep problems or irritability, especially in young children. So that is why a lot of times for younger children, we use non-stimulants.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's move to the non-pharmacological. I know that you've done some work in these, and so what are the things other than the medications that can help in ADHD?
Yeah, so there is really strong evidence to show that when parents or caregivers participate in what's called parent training and behavior management, and they apply some strategies to modify the environment, as I mentioned, and also learn how to manage specific behaviors, there is improvement. It's both in the symptoms, but more in the environment of the home or the chaos
Huh.
in the home. Homes are typically chaotic when there's a child or children with ADHD. And so that becomes better once those behavioral interventions are applied.
So just to dive in a little bit, because I'm intrigued by this. You're a physician. What is the prescription for a chaotic home? Like, give me some examples of what you might ask a parent to consider.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and this is something that again we're hoping that pediatricians can also consult parents on, not only developmental pediatricians. And the simple things we talk about are first of all making sure that you have a strong connection, building a strong connection with the child. That's the foundation, really, and you want to have a positive, strong connection with the child, and then on top of that, then you layer some structure, some reward system. One of the principles is called positive discipline. We don't want to punish them and say, oh, you were bad and you get punished, but rather catch them when they're good. You want to identify when they're behaving well, when they're not, getting up from the table every second or not yelling or not interrupting. Oh, that you did a great job there, and build a system of rewards. Those are just a few of the principles. There are also things related to structuring the routines also, so things are anticipated, and there's some visual aids also. For example, morning time is usually difficult, getting organized in the morning, so there are different techniques like that that can help.
And have they been studied? Like, are they working?
Yes, so there are studies that show again that there are when you take that type of intervention, you can see improvements in the behavior as well as in the environment of the home, the quality of life of the family.
Great. So in the last few minutes, I wanted to ask, because I know that you're using a variety of methods to assess the quality of care. Because of course, the pediatricians who are specializing in this disease are, as you said, they're using medications. They might be making prescriptions about a less chaotic home. How do you know if it's all working?
Yeah, so what I've focused on, and again, I came to this area of developmental pediatrics after several years of being a PCP, of being a primary care pediatrician, and my passion grew when I realized that we're not doing a great job in offering the right treatments always, or even knowing what the right treatments are. And one thing I didn't mention is that most children with ADHD are managed by their primary care pediatrician. And so that's why once I came to Stanford and specialized in developmental behavioral pediatrics, I decided to focus my research and my career on helping to support PCPs to
Ah,
know how to provide better care for children.
because they're on the front lines, and there are probably
Exactly.
not enough specialists like you to go around for all the
That's
amount of
exactly
kids
right.
with
Yeah,
the disorder. Good for
that's
you.
exactly
Okay,
right. And
so great.
Yeah, so that's why I chose ADHD, because it's so prevalent and it's clear to everyone that PCPs should be managing it. And indeed, they are. They're managing most kids. And so the way I've done it is my team has been looking at electronic health records. And we've been using, I started looking at natural language processing back in 2017 when my mentor offered it. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. And then this big AI boom came about. And so now we're using large language models and having really a great success in identifying what treatments are being offered. And so we're able to look, for example, and see for young kids, for those preschool age kids with ADHD, are the pediatricians recommending non-pharmacological interventions? Or maybe they're jumping to medications. Maybe they're not aware of the interventions. Are they giving the right counseling that we talked about to the parents, even if they don't know where to refer to? So all of those things we can glean from the electronic health record. And I think that's very exciting, because beforehand we were not able to analyze that data. And
Yeah.
this is especially for developmental pediatrics or any mental health related field. Most of the data lie in the free text. That's where everything is described. That's where the
Where the
symptoms are
physician
described.
writes their notes.
Exactly, exactly.
So and then I'm imagining that with an ability to do this, you could do like sensitive feedback to the individual physician that, you're doing a good job, but we have seen that you haven't made use of this modality. You might want to consider it. And of course, if it's delivered appropriately, they would probably be very glad to get this feedback, is my guess.
That's exactly right. And I think that's where it helps that I was a PCP myself. So whenever I interact with them, I say, I know I know how hard it is. I know you don't have time. But here, yeah, let's help you. It's really not punitive in any way. It's not judgmental, like, oh, you're not doing what you should be doing, but rather, listen, we can build a tool and we can help you, with also with the help of, again, providing you feedback. This is how you're doing compared to others. That's a really well-known motivator for clinicians to do a better job and to know what to offer to children.
So then now we can see a future where, as the basic findings in the field come from specialists like you have a way to then spread that to the primary care physicians to improve, basically float all the boats a little bit better, for the treatment and recognition of this disease. The last thing I wanted to ask, and I should have asked it before, is, um, in many situations that I'm aware of, it always helps to get the diagnosis early. And I'm wondering if that's the case here. I'm kind of assuming that if you can make a reliable diagnosis in a very young child, it gives you more ways to intervene and get better outcomes. Is that true for ADHD, or is it still a question about whether? I know it's true for autism. Is there a question about ADHD that you do better when you get an earlier diagnosis?
Yeah, I would say the evidence is not as strong, perhaps, as we know it is for autism. But for ADHD, my belief is that yes, it is very important to identify it early. We know, and the reason is because we know that in preschool age, if you have ADHD, you're more likely to not succeed in school, including elementary school. You'll have
Right.
problems, and so that's where really preparing and knowing in advance and coming into the school and coming into kindergarten prepared is a huge benefit.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. And if it's okay, I'd like to switch tracks now and go to our new feature called The Future in a Minute, where I ask you some, I think, simple questions, and you give me some simple answers. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
And are you ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay. What is one thing that gives you the most hope about the future?
Well, I think the most hope, the thing I'm most excited about also is really in applying the AI technologies, the large language models to identify rich information in the electronic health record and get a better sense of how well are we treating children. This is with ADHD or any other condition, and then also applying that to then improve their outcomes. And I think there's a lot of excitement about AI, for example, also in drug discovery and things like that. But I think the same level of excitement I feel about mining the rich information in electronic health record, especially for mental health.
What's one thing you want people to walk away from this episode remembering?
I want them to remember developmental behavioral pediatricians are really important in supporting children with ADHD. I think more people in the field of medicine should be aware of this field, especially pediatricians. And so we need more developmental behavioral pediatricians.
Aside from money, what is the one thing you need to succeed in your research?
I certainly need to have collaborators who have expertise that I don't have. Again, especially since I've focused my research on applying AI to clinical care. I need data scientists, I need machine learning experts, and that team science approach is critical for me to succeed.
If all goes well, what does the future look like?
Well, I think the future can look like that experts and primary care pediatricians are still the ones managing children with ADHD, but they have this incredible technology that allows them to have more personalized care, to understand better the treatments that we're offering and how those treatments can improve long-term outcomes for these children and their families.
And finally, if you were starting all over again and you needed to get your certification or your degree in a different discipline, what would it be?
Well, that's an interesting question. In medical school, I took improv theater, and I really enjoyed it. So I think if medicine and research wouldn't work out, I think I might, find myself on the stage doing some improvisation theater.
There you have it. Thanks to Yair Bannett. That was the future of ADHD. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Future of Everything. We've now passed 300 episodes, so we have a ton of issues that we can discuss in the back catalog of The Future of Everything. Please go listen, especially on a rainy day if you need some good conversations to listen to. I want to remind you that if you're enjoying the show, yes, the algorithm might put it in front of you, but the best way to spread news of the show is just to tell your friends, your family, your colleagues. Tell them, Future of Everything, this guy Russ Altman, not so bad. And that'll help us grow the show and make sure that we're responsive to the interests of the entire listenership. You can connect with me on many social media platforms, including LinkedIn, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, where I'm at Russ B. Altman or at RB Altman. You can follow the Stanford School of Engineering at Stanford School of Engineering, or more simply, at Stanford ENG.